Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to Where the Road Rises, Law, Lessons, Legacy, with me, your host, Eileen Curlin-Walsh. Our guest today is columnist Neil Steinberg. He is a prolific writer. Is writing for Chicago Sun-Times since 1987. He has written for Rolling Stone, Esquire, New York Times, Washington Post. He is committed to writing, as he says himself, every goddamn day. He is fearless, he is learned, sometimes controversial, but always brilliant. And I am just delighted that he will share his insight with us today. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Eileen. Thanks for having me.
Why don't we get started with your childhood, Neil? You grew up in Ohio. Your parents were Jewish. Your father was a NASA physicist.
He's a nuclear physicist. It was a little unconventional childhood. I was the only Jew in my school, which made me out there in the Ohio suburbia in the west side of Cleveland. And it was in my memory, very solitary childhood. So I spent a lot of time playing with blocks and army men and looking out the window. I think that's how I became a writer. School for me was fairly boring most places. And so I was trying to sort of create stories and to elaborate on a mundane reality to keep myself occupied and also to make fun of people who I didn't like.
Did your parents encourage your imagination, your storytelling?
No, I can't say they did. I think my father would have preferred I be a scientist. They didn't stand in the way. Journalism was sort of a side interest. I had a column when I was 15 in junior high school. I had a column in high school. I had a column in college. But yeah, I didn't think I was going to be a columnist. I thought I would be, we subscribed to the New Yorker, so I thought I would be sort of James Thurber, Robert Benchley, and wear a fez and hang out in New York City and write, funny things. And only as the years went by did that not happen. And but as a kid, I was in debate. I was smart, which is a handicap for children often. And so it was sort of, I was an odd duck, and my parents sent me off to Northwestern to train me as a journalist.
How religious was your upbringing? Your parents were Jewish. Was it very traditional?
I called weak tea Judaism. So they sort of imparted it upon us because they felt guilty not. But again, my father was a scientist. He probably never believed in God for a second. My mother sort of went through it. Her father's family had been killed in Poland. So it was sort of, this is the 60s, and it was the height of sort of, death cult Judaism, where we looked back on this horror, and that occupied a lot of our thinking. And I never believed in God for a second. I hope that doesn't, ruin my chances on your program, because I have a sort of faith, Spinoza's faith in the universe is this fantastically blessed and beautiful entity twirling around us, but the God of Deuteronomy with a big beard and sending people to hell and stuff. Although I like, I don't. Life is a long time and difficult, and so I would never put down another person's religion, because you have to believe in something. And the story I always tell is when my older boy, it was time for him to have a bar mitzvah. He said, "Why do I have to?" I said, "You don't have to at all." But to me, it's embroiders life, okay, and it's a tool to have in your backpack, so to speak. And it's like I was sending you, like you were going off to South America to hike through the rainforest, and I said, bring this inflatable raft with you. And you're like, "Oh, Dad, what do I need a raft for? I'm going to be in the jungle." I'm like, "Just bring it." And so you're hacking your way through the forest, and suddenly dragging this heavy raft, and suddenly you see the Amazon River, and you're like, "How do I get across?" "Oh, wait, I've got this raft." And so to me, that's what religion is. It's this useful thing that you have that sometimes is helpful to you. Does that make any sense at all?
Absolutely, absolutely, Neil, because I grew up in deep Catholicism, and while I don't embrace many of the actual beliefs, and I've certainly been disappointed by my church, I love the rituals and traditions and medals and holy water and blessings. And I too send my children to religious school to learn their Catholicism. And when they howl and protest, as your sons did, I tell them that this will come back to serve them. I might just use the inflatable raft next time, but they're those
Right.
rituals, those traditions, that sense of grounding, that link to many generations before us has many values to us, rather than just it being a particular direction to a
Sure.
particular God.
There's a ritual in Judaism I love called Hagba'ah, which is Hebrew for he who lifts. That when you're reading from the Torah scrolls, after you're done, you turn and you lift the scroll over your head to show it to the congregation. And the purpose is to say, look, I'm not making this up. It's written right there. Writer, I always like that. Plus, as someone who, you kind of have some upper body strength to lift that thing because it's heavy. And so, like you, I mean, the beauty of Judaism is that it makes you such an extreme minority that while everyone else is doing their thing, you're kind of sitting back. That's why people hate us so much, is because we're not doing what everyone's doing. And as a writer, that's a great skill in a way, to not go with the flow. You don't celebrate Christmas, you miss out. And you have to sort of, and you get the beauty of looking at life as an outsider. And that's, even here in Chicago, I'm a guy from Cleveland. I wasn't born here. I live in Northbrook, which is, University of Chicago Press asked me to write a memoir about Chicago. And the first thing I said to the editor was, but I live in Northbrook and I grew up in Cleveland. And so the book is called You Were Never in Chicago. And it's about outsiders like myself who come to the city, try to make connections and try to make their way. And I went looking for certain things to sort of prove my premise. And there's a famous book, I'm sure you're familiar, The Jungle, by Upton Sinclair. And I went to his, in a sense, being a writer can be like being a scientist where you have a theory. And so I went to his autobiography knowing what I would find. And what I found was the passage where he said, after The Jungle came out, a lot of people assumed I had to live in Chicago to have written it, to have exposed. And I said, no, I just spent 8 weeks among the meat packers. Had I lived in Chicago all my life, I wouldn't have noticed anything was wrong. Yeah. And I just so loved that, because to me, that's kind of what I do, is I take things that people don't think about and I say, hey, look at this.
Yeah. Or they have become blind spots to them because they were there all along. Neil, what I love about your storytelling is that it stops us in the clamor. Often I'll read your column. It's a busy day. There's so much going on. We're planning our lives, our children, and something just stops you and reminds you that there's more to this than just the mortgage and the children and their education. And a couple of examples come to mind. One was a column you wrote about the bravery of all those over the years who came out. And this was, I believe, when Illinois had legalized gay marriage. And your article said those people for whom it was almost impossibly difficult, who lost family relationships, but came out anyway, had all culminated in this great moment. And you've been initiated into the Chicago Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame.
Oh,
where does your compassion come from? How are you able to embrace and see that humanity when so many others seem to miss it?
Well, it's funny because I was a night shift reporter, and I was not an activist. I was someone who was sent to stories. Someone says, Steinberg, go there. And so I remember it was a Southern editor with a kind of a half sneer that the cops were having some sort of meeting at Town Hall District for the gays in Boys Town. And, go over there, see what they want, what they have to say. And what they had to say to the police was that they were, I remember the quote, this is 35 years ago, almost 35 years ago, the quote was, I've been arrested and I've been mugged and I'd rather be mugged. And so they were, the cops were asking them what they were afraid of, and they were saying, we're afraid of you. And so I did that story. And then I just sort of, I'm always looking, I'm very proud. I did the first in-depth piece of newspaper journalism about the transgender community in 1992. And it came from I just saw it as something different. And I remember at the time, the Gay and Lesbian Journalists Association asked me to speak. and I gave my little spiel, and they asked the question you just asked, where does that come from? And I thought about it, and I said, I think I come to it from a Jewish perspective. I see you as another loathed minority trying to get through your day. And so that was my approach is, if you dismiss how people feel, then it's an agenda, right? They're pushing this agenda. But if they're just people who want to live their lives, I just think that you have to ask yourself, is what this person is trying to do, get married, have a family, is this something that they shouldn't be able to do, that they should be denied them, and if it is, who's being harmed by this? And so, and I tend to be, to me, that's what my job is to be sympathetic to whatever group that I'm portraying. And so I've done, religious groups, Muslims. I did a story I was very proud of on Muslims where there are 5 prayer times through the day, and each one has a name. And so the story starts at 4:30 in the morning with the first one at a mosque, and you move through the day and find different Chicago Muslims in different situations having their obligatory prayers. And there was nothing connected to the news. See, I think that's the beauty to me of my column is I don't care about news. I don't care about corruption. I don't care about politics. I'm not trying to uncover some sort of dramatic story of a politician doing something wrong. I assume they're doing something wrong. They're politicians. To me, that's the dullest thing in the world. What I find really interesting are regular people and aspects of life that you don't see. And I'll give you an example. I did a Zoom tour a couple of weeks ago of the A.E. Staley Company. And what the A.E. Staley Company is, I'm writing about them because they created the Bears. In the 1920s, they were a starch company in Decatur. And my first question is, are they still around? And they are, and they're making starch. And so I contacted them and I said, I want to talk to you about starch because I've never seen a story about starch. And I'm really proud to be the guy who's right, because it sounds really dull, doesn't it? And
unless you write it brilliantly,
unless you find the interesting parts of it. A couple summers ago, we were all downtown, and I saw these big Ozinga concrete cement trucks pouring cement, and I thought, cement, that's something you just don't see in the paper. And it turns out that we're a center of cement, and the Portland Cement Association is doing experiments here, and they're making moon dust into concrete as experiments. And so, and I was able, it had to do with Trump Tower and how things are presented and the technology. And I'm not conveying the story as I should convey it, but I really enjoyed learning about that. See, that's how I'm blessed. I love to learn. And I write, every once in a while, someone wildly upset about something will write to me, complaining about it. And I'll say, but I didn't write it for you. I wrote it for me. I wrote it to learn about this and to try to make this interesting to people. And if you don't find it interesting, I don't think I failed. Maybe you're the sort of person who can't be interesting. Yeah. And also, how many stories about Donald Trump can you read, or about COVID? I'm doing a story now. I've done the interviews. I haven't written it yet on COVID, how COVID is affected. And I know people are going to, I'm really excited because you're never going to wonder that. And the reason I did it was I'm doing a book now that, again, the University of Chicago Press has asked me to write a book based on my blog. My blog is called Every Goddamn Day. And so they wanted to tell the story of Chicago in 366 dated entries. But certain dates just sort of hang there. And I went off looking to fill them, and I found something called the American Bee Journal from 1894, a beautiful publication with, Canadian beedom as a standing head and 16 pages of stories and stuff. And the first question I had was, is it still around? And it is. So I talked to the editor of the American Bee Journal outside of Chicago, and then I just kept going, talking to beekeepers about how and COVID has changed beekeeping. Yeah. And I'm going to give the reasons why. And again, you could say, okay, this is trivial and it's stupid, but I think someone should be doing stuff that's trivial and stupid. I'm proud to be doing it. I did a book about the death of men's hats. I was very proud of. Yeah. And it was an entire book about why men don't wear hats all the time. Okay, I thought I was taking something which is like a basic interest to people and presenting it in a way that was it wasn't, people didn't get it. A lot of people, some people did. It came out in England, came out in Granta Books, which is a fairly big publisher, put it out. And, I was proud of it. It's my favorite book.
And what of this writing life, Neil? Do you love it? Do you find it easy? Is it like, as Barbara Sher says, cutting a vein? Or is it,
No, I'm not. Maybe it means that maybe I'm in mediocrity and I'm facile. But to me, I think of that Noel Coward line: "Work is more fun than fun." I have my blog is called Every Goddamn Day, and the days I don't write for the paper, I just write a blog post anyways. And it could be taking a word and doing a deep dive into the word. I was in the Science Museum in London, and they had a steam engine called the Rocket, and from 1830s. And I thought, is that where the word rocket came from? No, of course not. Rocket's red glare. And I kind of go back and I pick apart the word for 2,000 words. And no one paid me for that. Okay, I've got advertising on the blog and stuff, but I just did it because I was interested in it. And so to me, the writing, to do what I do, I've been at the paper for 34 years. Okay, my column is 25 years old. And I wake up and I do whatever I want. And I get paid a lot of money and people react to it. I mean, I'm not important in the sense that Nicholas Kristof at the New York Times is important. Okay, sometimes I write something and the same dozen people comment, or they're just crickets, especially something I really think is great. There's like Daffy Duck with the crickets at the Hollywood Bowl. You go ta-da, and there's just nothing. Mm-hmm. And okay, it's nicer when there's something. That's why I'm talking to you. This is nice. Yeah. But I'm really doing it because I'm trying to be interesting and I'm trying to give people something to read. That's really my goal. My column's never done anything in the sense of being important culturally. The one thing I did was I did a book on failure, and I was looking for something about schools because an editor at Doubleday said, write a book about failure. And so this is the hardest part about being a writer is you have to demonstrate that. I'm a nonfiction. I'm a journalist. I don't make this stuff up. So I wanted something to present to the reader about failure in public schools. And I thought, should I have a kid failing a class? That seemed kind of dreary. Someone not getting in cheerleading. That kind of seemed sad. I saw a sign for it. And the National Spelling Bee is perfect. 10 million kids enter. In this public, humiliating process, becomes more public and more humiliating as it goes on. And it's spelling. It's stupid. It's not even a valuable skill. And so I followed this girl through a year of the bee, and it was this Dickensian horror. But then that kicked off like spelling bees as literature. That was the first in 1994. So this is the first thing ever written. Then Mina Goldberg wrote Bee Season, and she credits this chapter of this book where I spent a year with this girl. And so, in other words, what I'm trying to say is I have a little bit of impact. I mean, I've been on Oprah and Good Morning America, and but there's always what I call mitigation. I mean, I remember for the Chicago book, I had my books have been reviewed in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and different things, but I'd never been reviewed in the New York Times, and that to me was like the avatar of significance. And I really wanted that. And so my agent calls me, Susan Ray Hoffer, a wonderful agent in New York City. She calls me, she says, I have good news and I have bad news. I said, well, tell me the good news. She said, well, the good news is your book is reviewed on the front page of the Sunday New York Times book review. I said, what could the bad news possibly be? And the bad news was she hated it. The reviewer hated every word. There weren't two good words we could put together in the review. It was a complete pan. And I remember thinking, I did not ask for a good review in the New York Times.
Next time.
And I had fun with it. I wrote a column about it. So, getting to the writing life, I feel protected by being obscure, if that makes any sense. I've known people who become like best-selling authors and are destroyed because popularity, fame, it's like any other addiction. You're then... when I do write something that resonates, A, it's not the thing I would have resonate, and B, then you're just sitting there waiting for more adulation, and it doesn't come, and you have to go back to what you're doing anyways. And again, the most successful column I was reviewing in the blog, I do a year in review, and the thing which resonated across the country was a column I was embarrassed to turn in. I did a column on what happened to Fresca, the diet soda, because with the pandemic, it disappeared. And so and Coca-Cola didn't want to say. So the column is really, it's not about what happened to Fresca. I never really find out, but I'm badgering the Coca-Cola company, trying to get them to tell me. And that's kind of the fun I have with it. And so it became, when you put in what happened to Fresca in Google, my column came up. And it was like for days, if not weeks, it led our leaderboard because people all over the country were, now is that an accomplishment? Well, kind of.
Isn't it wonderful that you can know your craft so well and get to really learn people? And every now and then your craft surprises you. You can be surprised by the Fresca column.
Yeah, no, it's never, I made posters for my blog down in Hat Show Print in Nashville. And the second one I really liked, it said in big letters, life never becomes dull, we do. And I believe that strongly. I mean, there are days where it's hard, where you don't feel like it, where you make a mistake, or people are critical, or this and that, especially with online. I never read my comments. People, say the vilest, most disgusting things. But you get by that, this is better than working, I guess it is a passion.
Now, the actual arrangement of words, I know that you take great pride and great time. Is that a gift, or is it something you were interested in and and I know you're very learned and intellectual and have tremendous study done in all the areas in which you're interested in, but you've been writing columns since you were a teenager. There must be a gift in there somewhere. Do you acknowledge that?
I think, you do have a talent for juxtaposition, or for telling something in an interesting way. I do think it's a gift, but you have, like any gift, you have to develop it. You have to do it over and over and over again. I can be a very fast writer, and I can reach in and grab. I call it the thing. It's the interesting thing. I love to go to factories, and I very rarely had a factory call me up, and a guy said, I see you're writing about factories. Will you come to my plant? I said, what do you do? He said, well, we're Cool Commission. We cut up chicken. I said, well, do you raise the chicken? No. Do you cook it? No. We just cut it up. Like, that was the lead. If they don't raise it, they don't cook it, they just cut it up. And so I went there as a challenge. And I thought I was going to be thwarted, because it was big wooden bins with bags full of bloody chicken. And I'm getting the tour, and I'm thinking, what do I write? And they bring me into a room with the 15 Puerto Rican women, and they're cutting up. It's a middleman, okay? Because if you want to have a chicken dinner for your 2,000 guests at the Hilton, you need 2,000 4-ounce chicken breasts. And you can't call Purdue and get that. It's too small an order. You can't go to the Whole Foods. It's too big. And so they're a middleman providing discrete units of chicken. Yeah. And so I'm looking, and I guess this is where I bring the insight. And I realize what isn't there. And what isn't there are scales. And so I say to the woman cutting up, I say, how do you cut up a 4-ounce chicken breast without a scale? And she gives me the hey idiot look, and she holds up the piece, and she says, I've been working here for 10 years. I can hold this in my hand and tell you what it weighs within a 1/4 ounce. And that's like the human element. You kind of get to know the woman cutting up the chicken. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it's sort of like following the girl through a year of the bee. Okay, I gave every word. I started with her junior high school and all the way to Washington. It's spelling bee is the dullest thing in the world. So how do you make that interesting? What I did was I brought in myself trying to tell the story, first of all. So you see me calling up her mother and saying, hi, I'm a journalist. You don't know me, but I'm writing a book on failure, and I want to follow your 12-year-old daughter around for a year so that I can capture her humiliation on the national stage and put it in my book. Okay. And I must have done it well, because she agreed, and then you get to Washington and you see the Scripps Howard PR people, these Shakespearean clowns who are obviously embarrassed about the bee. And so they were, what are you writing about that you've come from Chicago? And then they kind of come on and say these really self-indicting things. Yeah. And so I guess that's something I think a lot of journalists don't do, where they don't have the patience. I'll take notes on something and hold them for years. Like, I'll have a story I want to do that I've been waiting for years to do, just because you have to find the right outlet for it. Mm-hmm. Granta, the literary magazine in London, I've written for them for years, and they were doing a issue on horror. And so I said, I want to do a story on why disfigured people are scary. And that's a very ambitious story. Mm-hmm. And I ended up waiting for years, and I finally did it for Mosaic, which was a a website of science and health that the Wellcome Trust did in London. And I spent a week at the Craniofacial Center watching an anaplastologist make an ear for somebody. And it opened up into this whole thing about why intellectually, if you see someone who has been burned, are you scared? And you get to meet the people, and and it was a very difficult, very complicated months to do. But as you get older as a writer, you worry about phoning it in. Okay, where you do it easy and you're lazy and you kind of just, because I can do it quick. I can just sit there and what did Donald Trump say today? Write something outraged about it in a different way and put it on, done. And those are the most popular columns. That's what people want. But I did a column over the summer I was very proud of. Can I tell you about it real quick? Do we have time?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm just turned 60. Okay, no spring chicken. And my doctor said, it's been 10 years, you need another colonoscopy. And I said, oh God, do I have to? It's such an unpleasant. He goes, well, there's a home kit now you can take called Cologuard. And I'm sealing the big jar. And this to me, I earned my pay. I thought, who's going to open the jar? What's that job like? And I drove from here to Madison, Wisconsin to talk to the people opening the jars. I got lucky. I convinced the Cologuard people, hey, can I talk to the people who open that specimen and do whatever they do? And I did we ran for two days in the paper. And it was an important issue, cancer, colonoscopy, home health care, COVID, it all worked together. But I'm extraordinarily proud that I'm the journalist who thought, who opens the jar? Yeah.
Absolutely. But as I listen to you, I'm thinking about the storage. So do you store those little stories in your mind? Do you have little clippings? Have you gotten fancy and digital?
No. I don't. I'm bad at notes. I never, when I write books, I don't outline them. I have an idea, like today's column. Okay, today was about the vaccine and how people are going to, whatever, I took the vaccine and I got hit by a bus, they're going to blame it. And I know a little Latin, and so it starts post hoc ergo propter hoc. And I create a little scene like this is the Sun Times School of Latin, Latin COVID workshop. And I write on the board, post hoc ergo propter hoc, and, after this, therefore, because of this. So I give, and you don't need that. I could just, and I talk to different doctors and things, I could just jump into that. But to me, that's like a little, I like to give, there's what you're telling them and there's the way you're telling them, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. And so I have certain things I want to get to, like the disfigurement story. I spent years waiting to find a place that would let me do that. I write books and don't want to publish. I went out, I took a 5-week trip with the boys. I got back, I wrote a book about it, and it's like, it's like nothing happens in the book. But someday maybe I'm going to print that book,
Or get the stories from the book into columns when you find just the exact right venue or forum for it.
Right. Sometimes I pull something out, or I'll put it on my blog. There's a scene where 4th of July, we set off some fireworks and I set the hillside on fire in Nevada. And so I had a scene where I was leaving for the 4th of July, and the secretary says, you're going to shoot off some fireworks. And I go, no, but I can't explain to her why. So on the blog, I tell this story about me in this gravel road in the middle of nowhere in Lovelock, Nevada, setting off this thing and causing this big, terrifying fire. Look, I mean, to me, people, the gift that a writer has is to nobody cares. When I have a chance to say one thing to a writer, I say, nobody cares about your writing unless you care. You have to care. You have to make them care. The book about the death of the men's hat industry. Okay, to me, I take what is the oldest trick in the book. This is a dull story of haberdashery. Marry it to something interesting. And the way I tell the story is I tell it through the inauguration day of John F. Kennedy. Because John F. Kennedy was the last president inaugurated in a silk top hat. People don't realize that. And so I called the book Hatless Jack, and I use his inauguration day to tell the story. And sadly, people, they mistook it for a book about Kennedy. The Boston Globe reviewed it, and they said, now comes the most trivial Kennedy book of all time about him and hats. But it wasn't a Kennedy book. It was a book about hats, where I used the attractiveness. And I interviewed his brother to see how, because people blamed him for killing off hats when he was just reflecting the death of hats that had died decades before. again, I thought this is my break. I thought this was going to be, and it wasn't. But it came out in England, and I got some money from it. It's
And there's something very pure, Neil, about
I,
writing a book without already having a publisher. I think
oh
to,
no, I had a publisher. I
okay,
absolutely had a publisher. Plume Public. I sometimes do, not all the time. The book about the trip out west. It was really I wrote it for my boys because I went with my two sons and I came back. It starts with me coming back and laying in the hammock and thinking they are always going to remember that. And I thought, no, they're going to forget it because you forget everything.
yeah.
But I was there, and I can write this little book and I can leave it like a cache of provisions, and maybe they will find someday and they will happen upon it when they need it. And they'll go, oh, I had this adventure with my dad and he was watching me and I'm this character in it. And I thought, I'm going to do that. Now, when I got it done, I thought this could help people. This could be fun. I should publish it. But I'm disappointed I haven't published it yet. Actually, someone did. I sent it to an academic publisher, and they sent me a contract, but I didn't like the contract. So there is someone else who thought it was publishable. I wasn't going to sign away. And there's a business end to be.
Mhm. That really
I feel like I'm rambling on, Eileen. So I'll stop and let you ask a question.
actually, what you said segues beautifully into one of the subjects I wanted to talk to you about, and that was an ethical will. When we were communicating prior to the interview, I had told you that I teach ethical wills, which a beautiful tradition, centuries old, began in the Jewish tradition of reflecting upon one's life and not just telling the stories, but what the stories mean and how they have informed your life, what they've taught you, meaning, purpose, values, and belief. So what you were saying about those stories for your sons and it to be there maybe as a bridge or a cloak when they would need it is the essence of an ethical will. Your obituary writing puts me in the mind of ethical will. And indeed, you've written your own obituary. And I wonder, as a joke and for some fun, but did you reflect or did you just tell the stories or did you reflect upon the meaning of that life?
I'm very proud. If you read the obituary I wrote about myself, I start with Juvenal, the satirist, the Roman satirist, who I just love because, for many reasons, he was like a grumpy, like the god, the king of all curmudgeons, and he had no impact at all, as far as anyone can tell, on his own time. He wrote these 16 satires that were complaints, and so I kind of start my own obituary talking about Juvenal, about the man, who he was, and then I segue into my own story, and I basically say what I did and how I did it, and I don't think I quote. I'm a big T.S. Eliot fan. I love poetry, and T.S. Eliot basically says that for us, there's only the trying. The rest is not our business. And so he basically talks of people. This is in four quartets. That we were not defeated in that we kept on trying. And that's how I view myself, as someone who continually tries. I'm working on my 9th book. They're not failures in the traditional sense. I make some money from them, but the world is not clamoring for new ones. And so getting to my sons, I try, they're both here now. They're both third-year law students. And I try to impart on them a sense of being engaged in the world, a sense of working hard, of being proud for your product, and of not being arrogant. Being smart, one tends to be arrogant, and to, as horrendous as the Donald Trump monstrosity is, I try to point out that, people embrace that for a reason. I did a column I was proud of where I came at it from addiction. I'm an alcoholic, and I've written about it a lot. And I say that it's like the way a heroin addict he wants that high and doesn't care about how it's destroying his life. And to me, the president provides this high, not to delve into politics, and it's easy to criticize people, and I do it a lot. But you also should understand them. You also should try to figure out why they're doing this. And I think it's a much better question to ask, and leads to better writing.
I love that. And yes, Neil, and one of my questions for you was, you talked about, if you were to look at your life, the trying T.S. Eliot, and you've interviewed so many people. You've interviewed them in the throes of grief. You've interviewed people struggling. You've interviewed people at the height, excelling when things couldn't be any better. And I wonder how that informs your belief in the human life, the human condition. What do you think of us now? How are we doing?
I look, this is a terrible time for people. And I mean, but it could be a lot worse. You know, a line, and it's a little bit of a shocking line, but I like, I don't like for my writing to be dull. And so I put in the paper, I said, all the optimists in my family are back in Poland in a pit. And so I look at this moment and think, if this is as bad as it gets, we're fortunate. Okay, so I do bring my, people are like, oh my God, can the country ever get over these divisions? And I said, well, we had a civil war. We had 600,000. I mean, people have such a narrow view of this moment, and I am very positive because I do look back, to even in my own lifetime and see, how groups, speaking of transgender, I never thought these kind of things would, people would be able to live their lives in an open fashion like this. And so for people who go, it's as bad as it was 50 years ago, they don't remember how it was. And not that I always remember, but I do know. And I think that it's a wonderful thing to embrace history, to embrace your time, and to try. I mean, I'm not in it as a writer in the sense that what I write doesn't then echo around. I'm not H.L. Mencken, okay, someone who I admired very much and would love to have been. But it's such a fractured world. I've written a couple columns. My father was a radio operator in the Merchant Marine, and so that image of the two radio operators in the Titanic, putting out their message as the waters rise, trying to keep their spark in their Leyden jar, and just putting out their message as long, keeping your station until relieved. I have a friend who's an editor up in Canada, Michael Cook, and I say, I'm manning my station until relieved. And so, I see it as a duty. I enjoy it. I'm not sacrificing, but I'm trying to put out what I consider a useful message to people for as long as I can do it, until someone stops me.
And you mention your relatives in Poland in the pit, and it is shocking. What are your thoughts on compassion, not just compassion, but forgiveness and mercy? Can you look back and forgive others? Can you forgive yourself for any of your transgressions? Have you written about forgiveness, Neil?
Oh, of course. I did a book called Drunkard about, I slapped my wife and went to jail. And it was about what happened. As I'm a big Dante fan, speaking of Catholicism. And so what Dante teaches is that if you go to hell, you take notes. And so I wrote this book about the process. And I truly thought, being an alcoholic, that I would, at the end, it was going to be the first addiction book where you go back to drinking at the end. And only about halfway through, I realized, oh, this is a huge problem and I've got to fix this. And so, acceptance is huge in there, and making right to the people you've wronged. I think to be vindictive, to be, as a writer, you still have enormous power. What goes in the paper can really hurt people. And I give what's called the speech, where I call the speech, where I say, you understand this is going to go in a newspaper, which people are going to read. And they're, and so I think it was last Christmas. Someone called me and said, there's a guy who lives in a van in the Home Depot parking lot and has for 3 years. And so I went there in the city. I knocked on the door. He only lived in the van, but he had a Doberman Pinscher, 2 cats, and his mother. Okay, for 3 years in this van with flat tires. I took him to coffee, and I said, "Look, I'm only going to write this if you want me to. Okay, I could write this, and people give you all this money, and you can move into an apartment, and we can raise $50,000, and all this good stuff can happen. Or I could write this, and they fire you from. I called Home Depot to make sure they weren't going to fire him." I don't want to wreck this guy's life because I'm going home to Northbrook to my 5-bedroom apartment in my good life. Okay. And I took a trust drop where he said, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want you to write. So I wrote nothing. And I didn't need his permission, but I felt morally that I was coming from a place that I knew what could happen with this. And so I do think you have an obligation to your subject. He's not a bad person who needs to be brought down. He's a guy who lives in a van in a parking lot. And I don't want to make his life worse. So I laid out what could happen. And he picked this. I was sorry. I laid it out because it's a good story, but I let it go.
Yeah.
And that to me, that happens a good amount because I've written about people who then go kill themselves, and I don't want that to happen. It's just another column for me.
Yeah.
And, so I try to make sure that I'm honest and open with people.
Mhm.
Look, I had in my book about Chicago, I have a chapter with a guy named Ed McElroy that I went driving with, and he was an old sort of a fixer. And I normally would never have a subject read the piece, but he was 85 years old. And I just didn't want our friendship to end with me screwing him in print in my book. And so I read it, and there was one scene in the 50s where him and Frank Pape, the toughest cop in Chicago, were finding bad guys, stripping them naked, and dropping them headfirst down sewers as sort of a hint they should leave Chicago. And I said, Ed, it's 50 years ago. It's a good story. Why wouldn't you want that? And he said, Neil, I'm a Catholic, and I'm supposed to give a good, example to people. And I took it out. As much as I liked the story and I thought he was wrong, but it was respect to him.
Mm-hmm.
And again, so I don't know if that's mercy or what, but you have a bunch of obligations as a writer. You have to the piece, you have to the reader, you have to yourself, you have to the people you're dealing with, you have to the people who are paying for it. Mm-hmm. And you have to bring all these together and somehow be both ethical and interesting. And that's a sweet spot in the middle.
Absolutely. Neil, I don't know if you listened to Krista Tippett's On Being on NPR at the weekend. She beautifully philosophizes and has wonderful guests. And her guest this weekend, Jennifer Hecht, said, we are indebted to one another. And that debt is a kind of faith, a beautiful, difficult, strange faith. We believe each other into being. Life would be meaningless, purposeless if we lived it completely alone. And I love that. And I love the idea that we have a debt to each other. And I believe that's exactly what you're saying. That man in the van in Home Depot could not have harmed you. And yet you kind of saw the debt you had to him, and with that moral code as a writer that you have developed, you did the right thing. Do you think we have this debt to each other?
Oh, absolutely. I think, look, if you look at our society, it's a range, okay? And here's Robinson Crusoe living on his island, and here's a hive of bees. Okay, and I touch on this actually in Hatless Jack. You wore a hat because you had to. Society put a burden on you, and if you didn't wear white gloves, you were not dressed. Okay, and so as we become more, everything is a flip side. So people, you talk about the gay community. As you're saying, I have a right to be whoever I want. Then also you lose the obligation to do what other people want. And to me, there's this balance. And what we're seeing now in part is a society out of whack, where you forget your duty to your fellow citizens. And everyone is just sort of locked in this Manichaean struggle against each other. And you forget that you're all Americans, or you're all whatever country you're from. And I think it's a terrible risk we're taking now, and that we need to get back to our commonalities, to the interaction. One thing, and that's the beauty of working for a paper. When Trump was inaugurated 4 years ago, they sent me down to Fairfield, which is 250 miles from Chicago. If you line up 102 counties in Illinois, Cook County went 78% for Hillary, and then skip 100 counties, and Henry County went 84% for Trump. And I spent 4 days there with people and spoke to the Rotary and sat with the mayor and everything. And they were the nicest people in the world. Okay. But I saw why they did what they did. And to understand that and to reach out to it's a great lesson, I think. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. We can be different, but we still have commonality. We're still part of the same thread. Barbara Sher again says we are placental creatures. So to have those differences and still realize that we have the commonalities. Absolutely. Yes. Let's talk about books. You absolutely love them. You've written 8. You're working on your 9th.
Yes.
I watched a piece you did for Independent Bookstore. It was maybe
the tour of my office. Yes.
Yes. And one of the things that stood out for me was that you said books present themselves, the one you need exactly when you need it. And it reminded me of the Rim of Requirements in Harry Potter.
Yes.
So, what are some of your favorite books, and what roles have great books played in your life?
One of my favorite books of all time is Boswell's Life of Johnson. I read it late in life. Adam Gopnik wrote a piece in the New Yorker about 2008. For those who aren't familiar, Johnson was the great man of English letters in the 18th century, wrote the famous dictionary, and Boswell was this Scottish sort of hanger-on who followed him around and wrote this. And it just is a book. I mean, it inspired me to. I did a book designed to help people through alcoholism called "Out of the Wreck I Rise," where I took quotes. And if you saw my copy of Boswell's Life of Johnson, it's just all post-it notes where he said these wonderfully, because he struggled with drink himself. And so he just said so many powerful things that I found helpful to myself. So I just love the way that Boswell revivifies him, in a sense that he preserves his life in this book, in this vessel. I felt the same way about Seneca. I love the classics. And when people say that, I read the Iliad and the Odyssey again and again, every time they're translated. And when Robert Fagles did his translation 15 years ago, I thought this has to be it. And then Emily Wilson, just as she was the first woman to translate the Odyssey out of Greek. And I thought, well, how could she be better? And she was. She brought this, forgive me, female sensibility to it that's focusing on the slaves, on the women in the story, and just having this wonderful turn of phrase where Pallas Athena, the goddess, is in the form of a little girl with braids, and she sees Odysseus and she says, "Hey, Mr. Stranger." And I just loved that. I loved just the freshness of it. I love Juvenal. I love. I do like novels as well. I love Confederacy of Dunces. Speaking of people where, John Kennedy Toole takes a fat guy pushing a hot dog cart in New Orleans and takes you into his mind, and you see his whole elaborate philosophy and structure. And so just, when you find a book that you just adore, could be Robert Caro's books of biography of Lyndon Johnson. I never would have, I hated Johnson. Why would I ever want to read a book about him? And you just open it up, and just the research, he just pulls you into this story, this American tale of this man who lived in this scrap of nowhere in Texas and became the president of the United States. It's incredible. It's a masterwork. Yeah. So certain writers like that, like John McPhee, he had a book called Oranges that was about oranges. It was this deep dive into the fruit. And I read many of his books. You mentioned Oliver Sacks. Okay, Oliver Sacks has this delight in yes, he's a neurobiologist or whatever, but he's also landing in Tinglapp out in the Pacific somewhere, and has all these different tales where he's a man of about chemistry and about science and about humanity as the doctor you want. He gave a speech in Chicago, and I went up after the speech, as someone does, and I was so enthralled hearing him talk to other people. I thought, I'm not pressing myself upon him so I can say I met him. So I stood almost, and then I just said, I'm not going to bug him. I left.
I would love to have met him too. And that was actually going to be my last question for you, because we are both fans of Oliver Sacks. And I love too, getting back to the obituary writing and the ethical will writing. He really restored the medical narrative. And I think it's kind of something I think we should do in the legal world, is to kind of unwrap people's stories unwrap their needs through their stories. And one of the things he wrote about the Sabbath, I wanted to read to you, and I kind of wanted for you to reflect, not that you're at the end of life, you certainly have a long way still to go, but he had written, "The peace of the Sabbath, of a stopped world, a time outside time was palpable, infused everything. And I found myself drenched with a wistfulness, something akin to nostalgia. And now weak, short of breath, my once firm muscles melted away by cancer. I find my thoughts increasingly not in the supernatural or the spiritual, but on what is meant by living a good and worthwhile life, achieving a sense of peace within oneself. I find my thoughts drifting to the Sabbath, the day of rest, the seventh day of the week, and perhaps the seventh day of one's life. One can feel that one's work is done and one may, in good conscience, rest. So, as we reflect back on the life we've lived so far, what makes it good and worthwhile? And what gives us that sense of peace? Is it to have loved what we've done, our work, done it the best we can, being compassionate to our fellow beings?
Um, I'm very glad I had two sons. I had children. That gives me enormous comfort to see them set out into the world as the cycle of life. If you ever read Adam Gopnik's Paris to the Moon, a wonderful story of his wife giving birth in France, and he looks at this new baby and he realizes that everything he was doing was for this. So, for work, I enjoyed myself. I tried. I'm still trying. I think it's important. There is, Dante has the line about, basically going into the harbor and furling your little sails and your little bark, your little craft. And I like that. I knew a lot of guys in the paper who wouldn't quit, and they're being rolled in their 80s. And I have no problem with that. I from time to time, you think the paper's okay. I've done it. I'm not going to shake my fist at it. I'm going to say, when they call me for reaction, I'm going to say, now I'm rich in time. And that's the beauty of loving to read. And so it's, I feel I've left this stuff out there. And yes, in some dream, in 2,000 years, like Juvenal, someone says, that was worth it. That was worthwhile. And you can still read these things today. But people fall into oblivion. I was a big James Thurber fan, and Thurber just reasons. So I think that it's not so much that I did good work, that the writing is out there, but that I engaged in my world, that I was talking to Barack Obama about politics, in a locker room. And that's something that was real. And so I feel, being in Chicago was a great place to be. I traveled a bit, and I take comfort in that I did stories in Japan, on cuteness, that I went to Japan to go to a teddy bear's birthday party. That's not everyone gets to do that, and so Johnson has a line, Samuel Johnson, he says, when he was sick at the end, he said, "I will be conquered. I will not capitulate." And I do think that's important. I do think you don't want to just sort of go, done. I'm not a hobby person. I like to do this. And so I see myself, just writing books and hoping someone prints them, keeping on with a blog. But you only have one life. And Mary Oliver, a poet, has a wonderful line. She says, I'm going to mess it up. What will you do with your one fierce life, or fierce and beautiful life? I'm messing up the quote, but it's basically, you got this, back over it. And I was always, again, T.S. Eliot was always trying. And so I can't make this stuff work. I could just put it out there and try to make it as good as I could. And I'm satisfied with it.
And mystery remains.
And so I think, yeah. So it's, the place is still, look, Hemingway has a wonderful line in the Sun. I don't know, it's in, whatever it's in, he says, "The world's a fine place and worth the fighting for, and I shall regret very much to leave it." Something like that. And I do really feel that. I think that the world is a fantastically interesting place, and I'm so glad I was here. And when you see the chain of luck that had to put you here, to be this little moist, spark in between two vast and cold eternities, is a great blessing. And I am so glad that I had it.
Oh, it could not be a more perfect way to end this interview. I love that, Neil. I'm delighted we got a chance to talk. Thank you so much for sharing
Thank you, Eileen, for asking me. It was a pleasure to spend time with you, and send me this when it's up, but I'll social media, etc. But thank you for reading, and it really was nice to spend some time with you.
Wonderful. And thank you, viewers, for watching. If you want to know more about Neil, you can find him in the Chicago Sun-Times, always on his blog, everygoddamnday.com.
Everygoddamnday.com for the past 7 years.
Absolutely. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time on Where the Road Rises. Thanks, and bye.